Well, welcome again to Sacred Circle, especially to those who are joining us for the first time. I'll just briefly introduce myself a bit. I'm Erin, I'm an energy healer, and I specialize in working with the subconscious mind. I have a practice called Water's Edge that I began in 2019, and since then I've worked with hundreds of clients, and in the past year I've began to focus my work with other folks just like you who are deep feelers and sensitive souls. I started my studies with Dr. Brad Nelson, who is a now retired holistic chiropractor, learning the technique of energy healing that he developed called the emotion code and the body code. And from there, I also became an ordained non-denominational reverend through a ministerial training program over 2 years of study with the Center for Sacred Studies in California. So that's a lot of where my background and the way that I approach these circles comes from. And I'm also studying and learning new ways of energy healing to include in my work with clients as well. In my private practice, I do shamanic journey. I work with plants and crystal healing and sound and vibrational healing. So if any of that ever calls to you, you're welcome to reach out for energy healing work as well. I do work with people through private one-on-one sessions. I have group programs and self-study courses and retreats. And there's many ways that we could work together if that ever calls to you. I do this, offer most of my events and all of my work remotely, so anyone, anywhere in the world. And again, as I mentioned, my focus has been lately on working with deep feelers and sensitive souls to help us learn to own and honor our unique gifts and to heal the what I like to call hurts, habits, and hangups that come with being a deep feeler and what often feels like overwhelm, and flipping the script for us to help that feel more sustainable and even enjoyable instead. So to get into tonight's teaching topic, in previous circles, we set the ground like rules and information that you were born with your particular energy and your particular gifts. You were born this way. And we know that your energy and gifts led you to have a certain experience and perspective in life. Likely growing up, you were extra attuned to the nervous systems of the people in your family of origin. Conflict would have been incredibly challenging for you. You may have been made fun of for your sensitivity. You were probably a kid who was rescuing injured butterflies, or maybe you stayed home sick because you had sympathy pains for someone else but didn't know the difference between what was yours and what was someone else's. And you probably learned to be a people pleaser to some degree, because if everyone else in your world was happy, then you could breathe easier. Maybe you learned to be the unproblematic child as well. Maybe you stayed small and safe and tried not to cause trouble, and you're still living with some of those patterns. You may have also developed a codependent relationship with a parental figure in early life, or even become that parental figure yourself within your family. And you may have turned some of those bad habits or coping mechanisms we talked about so far into an escape from your deep feelings, or perhaps made the choice to just not feel and likely discovered that that wasn't working great either. So, despite all of the differences between us, and I know there are so many and our lives have taken different paths, yet there seem to be some very common ways of coping with our sensitivity that lead to somewhat predictable, again, what I like to call hurts, habits, and hangups for deep feelers in the area of protection and boundaries. And one commonality that I see in the energetic world beyond all of these like physical real world challenges we've discussed so far is that our energy fields are particularly porous. Some people have naturally occurring strong energetic fields, even without the awareness of what they're doing. They're just naturally guarded. But usually, deep feelers, that's not the case. And while I don't know the exact reasons for this, my suspicion is that it has a lot to do with the nature of feelings in general. If we are particularly emotional, energy sensitive, or empathic people, that means that inherently our energy is tuned into other people and their experience just as much, or maybe even more, than we're tuned into our own stuff, so to speak. And emotional energy is inherently watery and transferable. Like, if you cry, I'm crying. And so, as these experiences, as sensitive and emotional people, lead us to these predictable coping mechanisms, such as, again, people pleasing, constant caretaking. We can have an anxious attachment tendency, codependent relationships, hypervigilant nervous systems. It all starts to add up, and we become the yes person. We try to please everyone else, make life okay for everyone else, problem solve, etc. Or the reverse happens and we clamp down our boundaries. We try to shore things up, pretend we don't need anyone else, or turn off our emotions, and then our nervous systems react. So, if that's you, and it sounds like a lot of us are feeling a lot of the same things or experiencing a lot of the same things, and I was there too. I was guilty of all of these things, and it is still work for me. Again, in those early days, I never consciously saw it. I didn't know what boundaries were. I thought of myself as a helpful person, as an easygoing person. I really resonated with the idea of being a good girl, and didn't think that that was problematic or that I was just easy and without needs. And none of that felt problematic to me until I realized how much of a doormat I had become, and when I really started tuning into how other people were treating me in early adulthood. And instead of being grateful like I expected people to be, folks would instead trample all over me and take advantage of me. And I ended up in this completely exhausted, burned out state and was desperately in need of some boundaries. And so, indeed, the number one tool that we can implement to shift that people pleasing pattern is boundaries, as we've discussed. And again, when I was awakening to my energetic reality and my subconscious not knowing what boundaries were, I'm just going to go over, we've talked about some of them, but here's a starting list for us. And if you want to engage more deeply with this topic, I highly recommend a book called Boundaries and Protection by Pixie Lighthorse. And I also cover all of these topics that are here in our circle tonight and all of our circles in my online course called The Awakened Soul, much more deeply as well. But as a starting point, we can talk about our physical boundaries that govern our behavior or other people's behavior, what we are or aren't willing or able to do or receive from another person. This could be about activities, physical touch, personal space. Then there's our material boundaries on our time, our possessions, or our services. There's our mental boundaries around thoughts, opinions, or beliefs and what we are or aren't willing to engage with in another person. And then it's our emotional and energetic boundaries that we're going to spend the most time on tonight, because these are particularly difficult for deep feelers to navigate. And they're sort of, I believe, the touchstone. If we can get our energetic and emotional boundaries clear for ourselves, then the others will ripple out from there. So first, emotional boundaries. These help us to understand where our emotional experience ends and yours begins. It was 2 circles ago where we talked about the empath gift, and emotional boundaries are incredibly difficult for empaths because by nature, they are taking on, absorbing like a sponge, the emotional energy of other people. So, boundaries could look like giving ourselves that permission to not take on the emotional burden of other people, and also taking personal responsibility for our own emotional landscape, as well as that surfaces the often called shadow work of looking at the ways that we are complicit in our own suffering and in our own story, and relearning new ways of being, taking responsibility for those things and creating a shift in our lives. So those are emotional boundaries. Also impactful for deep feelers and sensitive souls are our energetic boundaries. And those are about where my energy field and energetic responsibility ends and where yours begins. So that can look like learning to tune out the constant barrage of energetic information we're receiving. And remember, everything is energy. If we can't tune it out or dim it down, then this is where our energetic overwhelm comes from, and we have to take responsibility for that. Otherwise, we're taking on all of that energy and internalizing it and digesting it and dealing with it all of the time. And again, we talked about this last circle with the feeling gift of energy sensitivity, where everything is energy, and depending on where we are in that spectrum of strength, we're deep in it and experiencing it in a physical way in our bodies. So that can be really challenging. And if you missed those circles, I highly recommend checking those out on my YouTube. I'll send out a link probably tomorrow, so you can catch up on those gifts and how those interact with our energetic experience of the world. So when we're looking to shift our unhealthy patterns when it comes to emotional and energetic boundaries, our biggest task as a deep feeler or sensitive soul is to take those first steps and create that ripple effect so that all of the other boundaries in our lives start to shift. So first was all of our types of boundaries, and second, let's discuss the function of those boundaries, and the primary being protection. And indeed, the intentional boundary setting means that we're keeping out unwanted energies or emotions of others, but they also serve like a helpful dimmer, as I mentioned, for our gifts that keep us on sort of hyper alert. And then their second function is filtering. So it's like pulling the blinds over our sensitivities so that we can tune things out or dial them up or down when it serves us. So this starts to get into learning to control our sensitivities and our gifts. And then third is that our boundaries can actually have a magnetizing effect as well. And this is where we start to talk about boundaries in a positive sense. There's like a reactive, an offensive, or a defensive way to think about boundaries, but they can also draw to us what we're needing, including our own healing, information, guidance, people, life lessons. So that's when they start to be maybe more fun, I think. And then the last aspect to know about energetic boundaries is that they can have different strengths as well. So it can be rigid, like a concrete wall if we needed it to. And in that state, our energy would feel perceived as likely unavailable by another person, or maybe even invisible. Or on the flip side, our energetic boundary state could be really porous, full of holes. And in that state, we might feel this pattern in life of being taken advantage of or walked all over. And we can exist anywhere in between. And so learning to shift what our field is doing and shift those energetic boundaries is where we begin. So again, to summarize, our boundaries can function as protection, filtering, or magnetizing. And they can have different strengths, from rigid to really porous and everything in between. And those boundaries exist on all levels, physical, material, and mental, but the roots of our hurts, habits, and hangups usually lie in the emotional and energetic boundaries when it comes to being a deep feeler and sensitive soul. So, what can we do to set good, clear boundaries on emotional and energetic levels? First, we tackle the emotional level. And this was brought up in sharing time, but this is where the biggest mindset shift we all need to make is taming our inner people pleaser. And whether you're already on board with that, you're somewhere in between of practicing or dancing with your people pleaser, or it just seems like a total stretch right now, that's okay. Just try on the idea for size that it's okay to put your own oxygen mask on first in this life. And for me, that was an incredibly triggering thought to receive, because to me, prioritizing myself felt selfish. And I promise you, prioritizing yourself is not selfish. But if kicking your inner people pleaser to the curb means that folks in your life do begin to resent you, then you just have to let them. That's the really hard truth, because no one will ever or can ever care about you more than you care about you. And everyone and everything around you, including your own subconscious, are used to you being the way that you are and have been most of your life. So you get to prioritize yourself first, period. And again, this can be incredibly challenging, but a good way to start is just by asking yourself throughout the day, what do I want in this moment? Or when presented with an option, is XYZ activity or event or person serving me? Is there an equal exchange of energy here? Am I feeling drained after I interact with this person or this experience? And what do I actually need? And then second, let's circle back to this idea that our porous energy field is there and talk about a conscious shift we can make, which is to start incorporating a daily ritual to care for our energy field. And when I'm talking about our energy field, it's the same as our aura or magnetic field. There's a lot of names for it, but it's the space surrounding you on all sides. And on average, it's about a 6-foot radius in all directions. And this is where I see shielding practices that maybe people already have not being effective enough, is that our auric field is really big. And so our field is picking up all of this information through our energetic sensors, just as our skin would through the sensation of touch. So when we're caring for our energy, we're not only thinking about our physical body, but this huge big field as well that we need to make sure we're visualizing our shield out far enough and capturing all that is us and our energy. So the daily energetic self-care we need to incorporate, it's 3 parts. And I like to follow this order of centering our energy, grounding our energy, and shielding our energy. And this is a ritual I learned on day 1 of my awakening, and I still do it every single day. And some of you have already downloaded my free meditation to learn how to do this. But for all of the new folks, I'll send that out in a link along with other resources and the recording of tonight's teaching. I'll send that out tomorrow. So it's about a 12-minute recording to learn how to center, ground, and shield your energy. And I actually, if it's possible, like best case scenario, to do it first thing upon waking while you're still in bed, and then last thing as you're in bed before you fall asleep at night, and just use that like getting in or out of bed as a reminder. Because for many of us who are really sensitive, dream states and our sleep space is, there's a lot of energy moving in that space as well. So I hope that helps illuminate the topic of boundaries a bit more. Tonight's just a cursory overview about how they relate to our subconscious wounds and our learned ways of being, and various levels that boundaries exist, and how we can start addressing, making changes for ourselves. And in next month's circle, we'll continue talking about more ways to care for our energy and really bring in that protection piece.